Hello, my name is Candace Ward, and this video will create a foundation upon which you can begin to build your knowledge of the nervous system. We'll begin by anatomizing neurons, then travel to the synaptic cleft to explore how signals are transmitted between cells. We'll end by touching on other types of cells in the nervous system. The learning goal for this video is to break down the structure of neurons. We'll dissect each component of the neuron and explore its contribution to the overall function of the cell. By the end of this video, you'll be able to answer questions like the one at the bottom of the screen that ask about the origin of specific structures within the neuron. Let's start at the beginning by defining what a neuron is. The nervous system is largely comprised of cells known as neurons, and the main function of the neuron is to send signals. These signals start out as electrical impulses, and the neuron later converts them to chemical signals. Now we'll break down the neuron into its basic parts. We'll travel from left to right, just like a signal being transmitted. On the very left side of our picture is the cell body. The neuronal cell body is also called the soma, and it contains organelles like the nucleus. The processes that extend off of the soma are called dendrites. Dendrites are the receivers of the neuron. They accept incoming signals from other cells. Just to the right of the cell body is a part called the axon hillock. Action potentials originate in this axon hillock. Continuing to the right of the axon hillock is the axon itself. The axon is the long, thin structure that extends out of the soma. Axons work to carry the action potential from the cell body to the other end of the neuron. And we can remember what axons do by recalling that axons carry signals away from the soma. The peach-colored bits surrounding the axon in our diagram are structures known as myelin sheaths. Myelin functions to insulate the neuron and speed up the transmission of action potentials. There are some cells that are close to these neurons that are called Schwann cells, and these cells produce myelin for neurons in the peripheral nervous system. In between these bulges of myelin are areas of exposed axon. These areas of an axon that are not covered by myelin are called the nodes of Ranvier. The nodes of Ranvier are essential for the proper conduction of action potentials. And finally, way at the right end of our neuron diagram are synaptic terminals. The MCAT may use one of several terms for these structures, including presynaptic terminal, synaptic bouton, or nerve terminal. The main function of the synaptic terminal is to release chemicals called neurotransmitters into the synapse. Once our signal is received at the dendrites, it travels all the way down the axon until it reaches the synaptic terminal. Let's look at what the neuron does with this information. The general function of a neuron is to transmit signals between cells. An important fact to know for the MCAT is that these two neurons do not touch. There's a space between the two neurons called the synaptic cleft. So on the left side of the synaptic cleft, we have the nerve terminal of the cell that's sending the signal, and on the right we have the postsynaptic membrane of the cell that's receiving the signal. Notice that it's the dendrites of the second cell that are set to receive the information, as we covered earlier. So this whole area of communication, the nerve terminal, the synaptic cleft, and the postsynaptic membrane, is called the synapse. Now that we know what everything is called, let's get some action. Earlier, I mentioned that the synaptic terminal is the site of neurotransmitter release. Once the first neuron releases these chemicals, they travel across the synaptic cleft and bind to receptors found on the postsynaptic membrane. At this point, they can either stimulate the neuron to continue the signal or inhibit the neuron from releasing neurotransmitters. Now, while our neurons are our main players in the nervous system, we can't forget about the support staff. There are other cells in the nervous system called glial cells. Glial cells provide support for the neuron in a variety of ways. To start off, let's identify our neuron in our diagram. This neuron is surrounded by glial cells that aid the neurons. The first type of glial cell we'll look at is the ependymal cell. These cells produce cerebrospinal fluid, which cushions the brain, circulates nutrients and chemicals filtered from the blood, and removes waste products from the brain. Another supporter cell is the astrocyte, which we see here wrapped around a blood vessel. Astrocytes establish the blood-brain barrier, which separates the blood circulation from brain extracellular fluid. This barrier is an extremely important division that protects our brain from chemicals and bacteria. Our nervous system also hosts microglial cells, which are another form of defense. These cells are phagocytes and thus act an active immune defense in the central nervous system. The last supporter cell we'll examine is an oligodendrocyte. Oligodendrocytes create myelin in the central nervous system, and in the peripheral nervous system, Schwann cells serve the same function. So for the MCAT, it is important to recognize that the neurons aren't working alone, and you may encounter these other cell types in a biology passage. Now that we've covered the basics of neuron structure, let's try a practice question. We're asked to identify the origin of myelin in both major divisions of the nervous system. Take a second and pick an answer. If you recall from earlier, oligodendrocytes make myelin in the central nervous system, and Schwann cells do the same in the peripheral nervous system. For the MCAT, you'll want to know the basic components and functions of cells in the nervous system. We followed the path of a signal through a neuron, starting at the dendrites, then traveling from the axon hillock down the myelinated axon to end at the synaptic terminal. We explored the synapse, across which neurotransmitters travel in order to pass a signal between two cells. And finally, we checked out glial cells, which function to support the neurons. You'll need to have a great foundation of neuron structure in order to understand the nervous system well enough for your MCAT. Keep working at it and you'll do great. Thanks for watching!